Greetings from Bach Network to the June 2020 Bach Marathon, organised by our friends at the Bachfest Leipzig. The theme of the Bach Marathon, Zur Rekreation des Gemüths, is at the heart of some research that Bettina, John and I are currently engaged with. Over the next 25 minutes or so, we will be discussing this theme in much the way that we do on our Bach Network dialogue meetings. So let's begin by introducing ourselves. Bettina.
Hello, I'm Bettina Varwig. I'm a lecturer at the University of Cambridge, working mainly on music of the early modern period and including a strong interest in Bach.
John.
Hello, I'm John Butt. I'm Professor of Music at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, working on Bach and other fields, and also active as a performer, as director, particularly of the Dunedin Consort, also a Scottish-based group.
And I'm Ruth Tatlow. I'm currently Fellow at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study and a visiting researcher at Uppsala University, based in Sweden. So
good. So we're all working on a number of new historically grounded approaches to the question of emotion in Bach's music, each in a slightly different area, and each building on frameworks developed in recent scholarship. So let's start with Bettina.
Yes, I think we all agree that Bach's music has something to do with emotion. It makes us feel something. In the time of Bach, this effect was usually discussed under the heading of moving the affections. And I've been interested in finding out about what was actually being moved here and how. Traditionally in musicology, this is understood as a process of representation. So the idea that Bach used particular melodic motives or harmonic progressions to depict a particular textual or affective content. So when you hear the final aria in Cantata 199 with its text, "How joyful is my heart," you hear the triple meter, you hear the major key diatonic figuration, and so on, and you understand that this music means joy. Or you hear the opening motive of that aria in the John Passion, "Eilt ihr angefochtenen Seelen," "Hurry, you besieged souls," and you hear the running semiquavers in the violins. And you understand that this depicts the faithful running to Golgotha to witness the crucifixion. Now that's all well and good, but I have always found this mode of analysis somewhat limited in the sense that it understands the process of hearing this music as a process of decoding. So once you've understood what this music means, its job is sort of done. And to me, this never fully explained what is so powerful and so moving about much of Bach's music. And so I started looking into how writers at Bach's time discussed this process of moving the affections. And it emerged that it was very much not just a cognitive process of decoding for them, it was a process grounded in what music did to their bodies. Because emotions were understood as phenomena that affected body and soul in tandem. And they were caused by the movements of what they called the vital spirits, which flowed around the body. Those spirits were a subtle, volatile and undetectable substance that was responsible for most of the body's life functions. And their flows fundamentally governed a person's emotional state. So in an experience of joy, the spirits flowed freely, they rushed to the body's organs and extremities, they caused a pleasant feeling of warmth and that sense of delight flooding body and soul. Or in negative feelings like fear or disgust, those spirits stagnated. They collected around the inner organs and the heart, leading to coldness and trembling, a pale face, and feelings of trepidation. So those opening words of Cantata 199, "My heart is swimming in blood," actually makes reference to that state of a heart inundated with stagnating liquids. This was called plethora in the medical terminology of the time. And so when Bach writes a string of dissonances in that opening movement of that Cantata 199, those dissonances didn't just represent a feeling of fear or remorse. they actually potentially instill that feeling viscerally in the bodily fibers of Bach's congregants. And so then that final movement of that cantata comes around, that moment of joy. And again, this did not simply represent the idea of joyfulness, but it allowed a listener's spirits to flow freely again after the contractions of the previous movements. So flooding them with that sense of relief and delight and generating a bodily spiritual state in which they could then receive grace. So what my research has tried to show is the fact that Bach's music was not simply thought to go in the ear to the brain to be cognitively processed and understood in terms of its message, but it actually tangibly affected the flows of spirits around the body, and so enveloped listeners in every fiber of their being. So that's where I'm at with emotions in Bach's music. I wonder if you have any questions that you want to ask to take this further?
I think it's wonderful. I think it's so exciting. It makes a huge amount of sense. I think it makes a lot of sense in the way that we experience Bach's music, that it's not just intellectual, but it's the whole physicality.
Thank you, Ruth.
Yeah.
And I particularly appreciate the move against exclusively thinking of music as representation, because then music's always after the event. It's always a Johnny come lately to the world. But in fact, what you're showing is that it's really at the front of experience, the front of the period we're talking about. And indeed, it's very interesting that the points you're mentioning still have validity for today's audiences, which I think is an important issue in what links us to the music of Bach so well. And I suppose the other thing that really strikes me about what you're pointing to here is that this is perhaps the period in modern history when theology, science and art were most sort of aligned together. You know, the notion of the sort of empirical or semi-empirical nature of flows of what we might now call hormones related to what is created through the godly panoply of the world, and that relates to the individual. And the other thing that really interests me about what you say is how it plays out in time, because we so often, when we're thinking about Bach, who's such a wonderful abstract composer in many respects, we tend to forget that his music actually has an effect over time. It's not all there in one flash, although sometimes in terms of contrapuntal combinations, one could say it's all there, but it's the fact that it plays out. So I think that's a great advance for us to think of Bach and music in general, of course, in the way you're pointing to.
Thank you, John. I mean, just as a brief response, I think that coming together of theology and philosophy and science and so on in that moment is really crucial, in the sense that once you get to the later 18th century, these things start very much breaking apart. And, you know, once Kant comes along and music becomes sort of an object of, mental contemplation, you can no longer link it in with those kinds of other processes that went on. And so when we sit in a concert hall now and music is supposedly this transmission from mind to mind, we cut out that whole bodily dimension in a way that I think limits our experience.
Yes, I mean, it's true that I think classical music has gained a huge amount in what you might call Geist, spirit, the notion of the human soul, but it's lost a huge amount of body along the way. And in fact, it's perhaps the popular field or various forms of the popular fields that actually teach us how important that is.
Absolutely. Yes.
Shall I say where I come in?
Yes, that'd be great to hear.
Yeah, so mine overlaps a little bit from what Bettina is saying, and we've been in discussion about it. But my starting point was this particular statement by Werkmeister. He wrote, "All consonances, as well as the motions of meter and beat, are purely those proportional numerals closest to the unison or equality. A human being," he writes, "is naturally moved to joy when such numeros sonoros, or resounding numerals, are instilled into his ears and then into his heart and emotions." And as we're all asking, the big question is how this works. How can the numeros sonoros, the sounding numbers of music, move a human being to joy? And how did composers exploit this natural quality of music? So the bit I'm looking at is the answers that lie in the physical resonances and proportions of sound, and in the way that composers exploited this natural power of music, which is written about quite a lot. So theorists of Bach's time explain that the way to create emotional effect is by cleverly constructing a composition, with every section ordered proportionally, with the understanding that the proportions of consonances closest to the unison or the one-to-one have the most joyful and pleasing effects. They expand the life spirits. Until recently, musicologists thought that these sources were speaking about musical intervals in a melody, and actually, Bettina, you've described it much better than I would have done. And talking about the locational intervals that caused the specific emotions of joy, sadness, and anger. Now, of course, although this is part of the process, these small scale effects last a split second, and I wasn't really satisfied with it either. So what I've noticed is that the theorists are also writing about the larger scale effect of proportioned sound, with the consonances 1-to-1 and 1-to-2 sounding across the duration of a complete section, complete movement, or even a complete composition. So an example is one sonata by Bach, by J.S. Bach, which has a consecutive 1-to-1 proportion, with 220 bars in 2 movements and a da capo, followed by 220 bars in the remaining 2 movements. So you get a consecutive 1-to-1. Now, earlier I understood this to be because the 1-to-1 was thought to be the epitome of beauty and a deliberate choice to imitate God's perfect creation, which of course is part of the philosophy of it. But now what I'm exploring is if Bach might also have created this large-scale 1-to-1 to heighten the emotional impact of this sonata. Now, obviously, the listener is not going to count these bars, but the resounding numerals, the impulse of each bar will be felt today as it was in Bach's time. And I have another little citation here. In 1717, Christoph Raupach explained that a person is moved by a well-proportioned composition, even if the person is not expecting to react emotionally, and even if the person doesn't know how or why. Now, interestingly, this goes right into the 19th century. 80 years later, the very famous physicist Ernst Chladni wrote something similar. He wrote, "The effect of music on us is because of the proportions. We feel the temporal proportions of successive movements. We don't calculate them ourselves, as if we were concerned about the numbers through which time and space were expressed, but rather nature counts for us. And the results of the harmonious proportions give us pleasure and, importantly, are reworked purposefully by artists." He cites Leibniz, you know, music is the exercise of the mind calculating unknowingly. So I'm currently working on how composers have reworked these proportions to harness the power and emotional potential of music. And specifically what I'm looking for is the recurrence of consecutive 1-to-1 proportions in different means within a work, but specifically the bars as well. And the use of mirror image symmetry that I and others have discovered in the structure of Bach's works and in works by other composers, because it's not just J.S. Bach, it's many others, and it goes on for quite a long time. So that's what I'm up to. How do you react to that? Any ideas? Any thoughts? Any questions?
Well, I think it's one of the ways, you know, if I may, you know, bring things back to the body. Sorry about that.
No,
Probably also at the moment, but there is a sense, of course, in which ideas of proportionality were at the foundation of how people thought about, you know, bodily health and well-being, in the sense that, you know, if you look at Athanasius Kircher, writing in the mid-17th century, he talks a lot about the way in which a healthy body is one where its parts are in good, you know, consonance with each other, and sinfulness and ill health upset those proportions. And then, you get writers, 17th century writers like Gemüths even saying that musical dissonance also is a result of original sin and the fall. That's when humanity went out of tune with the cosmos and so on. So I think this resonates very nicely with a lot of the things I've been thinking about in terms of bodies and how they operated. So I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. Well, I mean, obviously the sort of Pythagorean tradition, stretches all the way through the medieval period and the classical period. And we often tend to think that it sort of starts to disappear in the 18th century, as indeed it does in many respects, but it's still very much there, as Ruth's work in general has shown us, I think, and well into the 19th century too. And you could say that neoclassicism itself is also based on the concept of classical proportions and things. And I think when we're talking about the way Bach's music has an effect on us, I think one of the things you might be helping us with is the notion that there's a supreme confidence about Bach's music that gives us a sort of sense that everything is somehow all right in the end, whether we think of that in a religious sense or in a secular sense in terms of our civilization, what's left of it. So I think that what you might be pointing to is that Bach's control of large blocks of sound and their balancing one with another is one of the things that actually makes us sort of feel confident. It sort of harmonizes our experience in a way. We sort of sense that there's a sort of underlying order, even though we hear many surface ripples and dissonances along the way. So I think you might be putting your finger, in other words, on one of those things that people find so nurturing about Bach's music. Not everybody does, but some people I think really do find that it gives them a confidence or a sense of overall confidence, which is not unlike a religious confidence, but it's parallel to a religious confidence. It can be tied with one or separate from one.
Thank you. Thank you for that feedback. That's really wonderful. I mean, I have many questions myself. Can rubbish music that's ordered like this sound good? And, so lots and lots of questions. And is it one of the reasons why Bach's music has lasted so long? I mean, of course, there are so many different factors involved there, but I mean, I like the idea that it gives us this feeling of security and safety, a little bit like a classical building. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, what would really interest me is actually how these things play out in non-Western cultures which have some sort of appreciation or interaction with Bach. Japan is the obvious place to start, but there are plenty of other places as well. How do these play out in slightly different traditions, not completely different, but slightly different traditions? In other words, it's very easy to think of Bach as being a universal, and when you're talking about proportions, you are talking about universality, but I'm always skeptical of making that claim. But we need to sort of see how Bach relates to both the human condition in general, but also different historical and cultural manifestations of the human condition.
Oh, thank you. Well, John, your research.
Right, well, mine ties in with actually a sort of aspect of what Bettina was talking about earlier, and to a certain extent what Ruth has been talking about in terms of balance. And this was occasioned, I think, by my reading of a little part of Forkel's biography in 1802, when he says that Bach's music is suffused with dance on a level that no other composer of his time achieved. In one sense, this is obviously not true. I mean, all composers of Bach's time used dance incredibly deeply. But I think he was onto something when he sort of suggests that even in fugues, even in music, church music, even in the most serious music, you find allusions to dance. So I think it's not so much the question that Bach uses dance, they all did, and indeed writes dances, but the fact that so much of his music seems to be about dance. It refers back to dance, it takes us away from dance, makes us think about dance, and then reminds us again of dance. It's as if it's digesting dance. So this led me into thinking, well, how did dance play out within Bach's environment? Because we know, from many Puritan examples that dance is often seen as the pathway to the devil. And starting with Luther, as I suppose we must, it's quite interesting to see that Luther's comments on dance are very similar to his comments on music. They are sporadic, they're unsystematic, but where you'd find them, and the 1538 preface is an obvious place to start for the Rau publication. Luther talks about dancers as a sort of foretaste. In other words, we will experience dance as we will experience music in heaven. So dance seems to be connected with polyphony, it seems to be connected with both individuals and peoples, and it's also, in Luther's case, particularly connected with joy. And in various sermons and commentaries, one finds references to dance as an expression of joy, and as a gift of God in exactly the same way as music was. And if one looks at favourable writings on dance in the 17th and 18th centuries, France is the obvious place to start. One finds references back to the classical period, to Plato and so on, where dance is seen as a regulator of the body, a regulator of the external sides of our virtues, which mirrors our internal. So it's a way of using what we've got and honing it and using it to the best possible purposes, in exactly the same way one might use music towards the best possible purposes. And indeed, there's a very important Lutheran treatise on dance by Johann Pasch from 1707, which very much talks about how dance refines the natural spirit in exactly the same way as musicians say music refines the natural spirit. And one finds in Matteson's writings a great deal of references to dance as something, again, which unites the spirit, the mood. Each dance, in other words, is connected to a particular mood. So dance is a way of us exercising our moods and controlling them, but also using them, as he says, to the glory of God, to a deeper form of worship, is what Matheson says. So tying dance then with the spirit, with the individual and the honing of the individual, but also with the community. And of course, in French culture, dance is seen very much as representing the order of the court, of the society, coming out of that, refining the natural spirit. So it's very interesting then that there is a strong theoretical background that would suggest that Bach took dance very seriously, and as is absolutely typical of Bach, he uses it contrapuntally. He uses it in a way where we're sometimes distanced from it. I'm thinking particularly of the Saraband from Cantata 57, Selig ist der Mann, where the words of the aria, I would wish for my death were Jesus not to love me. So it's a subjunctive aria, and we hear a saraband at the beginning, which sort of shows us what it would be like, and then the singer comments on that, and then joins the saraband, then separates from the saraband. So we can almost feel how the physicality of the emotion that a saraband represents is played out in the music and used as a subjunctive view of what it would be like if Jesus didn't love us, and so on. So in other words, then, it seems to me that a crucial aspect of Bach's music is this digestion of dance, not just writing dances. There are plenty of them. The last chorus of the Matthew Passion is a straightforward saraband. You almost don't have to discuss it. But the fact that dance is used, quoted, and played out in the thoughts and psyche of the listener and the singer strikes me as a very important way of bringing back the physical aspects of emotion and human discipline within Bach thought. So that's more or less the lines on which I've been working.
Yeah. No, I have two thoughts in response. I mean, this is very rich, and I think they're also very. There are many interesting convergences here. I really appreciate the way in which you rehabilitate dance from its negative associations with the body, in the sense that the body is not necessarily just a problematic and negative aspect of human existence in Christianity, right? I mean, the flesh is, that's where sin is, as opposed to the spirit, but you could lead a bodily existence in the world in a spiritual way. And dancing could be part of that leading of a morally upright Christian way of life on earth with your body, in a way that exactly disciplines and helps you express and contain your inner life and so on. So I think that's a really important point. And then the other thing that your little exposition got me thinking about is the way in which dance can have those effects of cleansing the spirits, raising the spirits, without you having to actually do the movements. And I mean, in a way, I guess current neuroscience gives us answers to this, in the sense that we know that listeners have motor neurons firing when they hear music being performed, even though they don't execute those movements that the performers make themselves. It is part of what is happening in their bodies and minds, and so I think it's an important aspect to remember, that you don't have to be dancing to experience the physical and spiritual positive effects of what dance might do for you.
Thank you. And I think what that points to is the fact that memory is not just a mental thing, but something that we actually feel as well. And that would, of course, tie into Ruth's view of proportions of time in the playing out of a piece, that it's a memory that's distributed throughout the body in a certain sense. And I think the point about intuiting dance without actually doing it is a very interesting factor that we often forget. We were always said, Baroque players always say, you must learn to dance or you won't understand it. But actually, you often, by seeing people do it, you actually mirror what they're doing, even though you might be hopeless like me at dancing. In exactly the same way that I can appreciate a great violinist and hear them stretching up on the high string, and now I could not possibly play as well as that, but I can intuit what they're doing and feel it as part of the expression. And I think that's a very important aspect of our sort of mirror neurons.
Yeah. It is very exciting, this whole business about dance. And in Matteson, he uses dance as one of the examples to show how regular proportions must be put into music. And it's obviously a very simplistic one. But as you say, the having absorbed that pulse, having absorbed the nature of the pulsing, the feeling of a saraband in terms of the regularity. I mean, the dancer has to count, because the dancer needs to know how many times the opening is repeated. There is this sort of subconscious counting in dance as well. So it's the physical mirroring, but I also think this is almost an illustration of Leibniz, the subconscious calculating, the rippling effect of these pulses going through, which is going through your body as well, and especially if it's dance music. But as you say, you get something like the final chorus of the Matthew Passion, and you know where you are. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it is literally a binary set. The A section is a binary saraband with repeats, and the repeat, of course, is where the text is added. So you might actually think of, when you're playing a cello suite or keyboard suite, that when you do the repeat, it's as if you're adding the text, or you're adding an extra layer of possible meaning that you're already intuiting through the mood at the start.
Well, I think on that. Oh, Bettina, you wanted to say something.
No, just to say that although I don't know if we've, got closer to actually working out how Bach's music might have moved his listeners or moves us, I think one of the nice things that for me has emerged from this discussion is that there are these multiple routes into the question, and that it is not a monolithic, singular kind of answer to how does Bach's music move us, or how do emotions work in Bach's music. There's a way in which the answer is necessarily multifarious and incomplete, and continuously evolving in the way that we can just never quite encapsulate how this music has these effects on us.
Yes. And I think it's also a very interesting reflection on how history works, because some of the things we're talking about seem very real to us today. Other things seem very archaic, and they almost need to be abolished in a certain sense. And getting that balance between what's continuous, what isn't continuous, is one of the huge historical issues, of course, we're facing right now, and in terms of slavery debates and all the various things that went on in the 18th century that we would hate today. So it's very interesting to see how certain aspects of the trajectory towards the present are very much alive, and it makes us question, I think, what we need to work on in the future in terms of preserving our heritage, but also acknowledging those elements which are falling away or need to fall away.
Well, that's a wonderful natural ending, I think, to our very lovely discussion. And I think we should just end by wishing the Bach Marathon all the very best from Bach Network. So I think we should say bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.